The coins clicked softly as Emmett Oakley counted them for the third time, spreading the last of his silver across the worn wooden counter of the general store, knowing that once he spent this final handful, there would be nothing left until spring planting brought work again. 3 silver pieces and a scattering of copper pennies represented everything he had managed to save through a harsh winter of odd jobs and careful rationing. And as he stared at them glinting in the afternoon light streaming through the dusty window, he wondered if what he was about to do was the stupidest decision of his 24 years, or the only one that truly mattered. "You sure about this, Emmett?" Old Thomas Brennan asked from behind the counter, eyeing the silver with the practiced assessment of a merchant who had seen too many desperate men make foolish choices. "That is every coin you got to your name, and spring is still weeks off." Emmett nodded, his throat tight. "I am sure." Thomas sighed and turned to the shelf behind him, carefully lifting down the dress that had been displayed in the window for the past month. It was a festival dress, meant for the spring awakening celebration that would mark the end of winter and the beginning of planting season. The fabric was a deep forest green, embroidered with golden thread in patterns of leaves and flowers along the hem and sleeves. It was the finest piece of clothing Thomas had stocked all year, imported from the southern cities where skilled seamstresses still practiced their craft. 3 silver, Thomas said quietly, laying the dress on the counter between them. "That is the price, and I will not haggle on it. The seamstress who made this needs to eat too." Emmett pushed the silver across the counter, keeping only the copper pennies. Those would buy him bread and perhaps some cheese to last the next few days. After that, he would figure something out. He always did. Thomas wrapped the dress carefully in brown paper and tied it with string, his weathered hands moving with practiced efficiency. "She must be something special, this girl of yours." "She is," Emmett said, taking the package and holding it close to his chest. "She is everything." Outside, the village of Thornhaven was preparing for the festival. Streamers of colored cloth hung between the buildings, and the smell of baking bread drifted from the communal ovens. Children ran through the muddy streets, their laughter bright in the cold air. Spring was coming, finally, after the longest winter Emmett could remember. He walked quickly through the village, avoiding the main square where people would ask questions and want to know what he was carrying so carefully. His boots were worn thin at the soles, and he could feel every stone and rut in the road. He would need new boots soon, but that was a problem for another day. The path out of the village led north, toward the boundary forest where the settled lands gave way to wilderness. It was a 20-minute walk to the edge of the trees, and then another 10 minutes along a narrow trail that most people avoided. The trail led to a small clearing where an old hunting cabin stood. Barely more than 4 walls and a roof, but it had a working fireplace and enough shelter to keep out the worst of the winter cold. Emmett had found the cabin by accident 3 months ago, when he had been hunting for winter game in the forest. He had been following tracks through the snow when he had stumbled into the clearing and seen smoke rising from the chimney. His first instinct had been to turn back, assuming some trapper or hermit had claimed the place, but then he had seen her stepping out to gather firewood. Greta Emberwood was an orc woman, and the moment Emmett had laid eyes on her, everything he thought he knew about orcs had shattered like thin ice under a boot heel. She stood perhaps 5 feet and 7 inches tall, with a slender build that curved in all the right places beneath her worn and patched clothing. Her skin was a soft green, like new spring leaves, and her black hair fell in waves past her shoulders. Small tusks curved up from her lower jaw, delicate points that somehow made her more beautiful rather than less. Her eyes were a warm amber color, and when she had looked up and seen him standing at the edge of the clearing, They had gone wide with fear. He had raised his hands immediately, showing he carried no weapon. "I am sorry," he had called out. "I did not know anyone was here. I will go." But something had made him hesitate, and in that moment of hesitation he had seen her properly. She was thin, too thin, and her clothes were threadbare. The firewood she was gathering consisted of mostly twigs and small branches, the kind that burned fast and gave little heat, and there was a purple bruise on her cheekbone, still fresh and angry looking. "Are you hurt?" he had asked before he could stop himself. She had touched the bruise self-consciously. "I am fine. Please go." But he had not gone. Instead, he had walked slowly into the clearing, moving carefully so as not to frighten her, and had begun gathering proper firewood from the stack of deadfall at the edge of the trees. She had watched him with wary confusion, ready to bolt, but when he simply carried the wood to her door and set it down, she had relaxed slightly. "Thank you," she had said, her voice soft and uncertain. "You are welcome," he had replied. And then, because he was Emmett Oakley and had never learned to mind his own business when someone needed help, he had asked, "When did you last eat?" She had not answered, but her eyes had told him everything he needed to know. He had returned the next day with bread and cheese from his own meager supplies, and the day after that, and the day after that. Slowly, carefully, he had earned her trust. She had told him her story in pieces, revealed gradually over weeks of quiet conversation by the fire. Her name was Greta, and she had fled from an orc settlement in the mountains 6 months ago. She would not tell him much about why she had left, but he had seen the scars on her arms and the way she flinched at sudden movements, and he had understood enough. She had been making her way south, hoping to find work in one of the border towns where orcs and humans sometimes traded, but winter had caught her before she could reach safety. The cabin had been her salvation, abandoned and forgotten enough that she could hide there without being discovered. "People here hate orcs," she had told him one evening, staring into the fire. "If they find me, they will drive me out, or worse." "Not everyone," Emmett had said quietly. She had looked at him then, really looked at him, and something had shifted between them. It was not love, not yet, but it was the beginning of something that could become love if they were brave enough to let it. Over the winter, he had visited as often as he could, bringing food and firewood and conversation. He had learned that she was 22 years old, that she loved to sing but rarely did because her voice drew attention, that she was skilled at sewing and leatherwork, that she laughed at his terrible jokes even when they were not funny, that she dreamed of a life where she could walk freely without fear. And somewhere along the way, without planning it or even realizing it was happening, he had fallen completely and hopelessly in love with her. 2 weeks ago, he had asked her if she would come to the Spring Awakening Festival with him. She had looked at him as if he had suggested they fly to the moon. "Emmett, I cannot. You know I cannot. People would see me. They would know what I am." "So let them see," he had said with more bravery than he felt. "Let them know. I am tired of hiding. I am tired of pretending you do not exist." "They will hurt you," she had whispered. "They will say terrible things. You will lose friends, maybe lose work. I cannot ask you to do that for me." "You are not asking. I am offering." She had been silent for a long time, and he had seen the war playing out behind her eyes. Hope and fear, desire and caution, all battling for supremacy. Finally, she had said, "If I go with you, I want to look like I belong. I do not want to be the orc woman in rags that everyone stares at. I want to be beautiful just once." "You are already beautiful," he had said immediately. She had smiled at that, but it was a sad smile. "You know what I mean. I want a proper dress. I want to feel like a real person, not something that has to hide in the woods." And that was when he had remembered the festival dress in Thomas Brennan's window. The green one, embroidered with gold. The one that cost 3 silver pieces. every coin he had saved. Now, as he walked along the forest path with the package clutched to his chest, he wondered how she would react. Would she be happy? Would she cry? Would she refuse it because it was too expensive? Greta was proud in her own quiet way. She had not wanted to be a burden, had tried to refuse his help more times than he could count in those early days. The cabin came into view through the trees, smoke curling peacefully from the chimney. He could see her moving around inside through the small window, probably preparing the thin vegetable soup they had been living on for the past week. He knocked on the door, 3 slow taps that she would recognize as his. The door opened, and there she was, her amber eyes lighting up when she saw him. She wore the same brown wool dress she always wore, patched and mended so many times it was more patch than original fabric. Her black hair was tied back with a strip of leather, and her green skin seemed to glow in the warm light from the fire. "Emmett," she said, smiling that smile that made his heart skip. "I did not expect you until this evening." "I had something to do," he said, stepping inside and closing the door behind him. The cabin was small, barely 15 feet square, but she had made it as comfortable as she could. A pile of straw covered with blankets served as a bed, and there was a rough table and 2 chairs that he had helped her repair. Cooking pots hung from hooks near the fireplace, and dried herbs hung from the rafters. She looked at the package in his hands with curiosity. "What is that?" He held it out to her, suddenly nervous. "Open it." She took the package carefully, setting it on the table and untying the string with her nimble fingers. When she folded back the brown paper and saw the green fabric inside, she went very still. "Emmett," she breathed, her voice barely audible. "What did you do?" "I bought you a dress," he said, as if it were the simplest thing in the world. "For the festival." She lifted the dress from the paper with trembling hands, holding it up to the light. The golden embroidery caught the firelight, glowing like captured sunshine. The fabric was soft and fine, nothing like the rough wool she was accustomed to. She ran her fingers over the stitching, tracing the patterns of leaves and flowers, and he saw tears beginning to well in her amber eyes. "This is too much," she whispered. "Emmett, this must have cost a fortune." "You cannot afford this." "I could afford it," he said, which was technically true. He had been able to afford it right up until he paid for it. "How much did you pay?" she demanded, looking at him with sudden suspicion. He considered lying, but he had never lied to her and he was not about to start now. 3 silver. Her eyes widened and the tears spilled over, running down her green cheeks. "That is everything you had saved. Emmett, you fool. That was meant to keep you fed until spring work starts. You need that money." "I need you to have a dress more than I need a few extra meals," he said firmly. "Greta, please try it on." She looked at him, then at the dress, then back at him. The tears were flowing freely now, and she was shaking her head even as her hands clutched the fabric to her chest. "I cannot accept this. It is too much. You should not have done this for me." "Try it on," he repeated, his voice gentle. "Please, Greta, let me do this one thing for you." She stood there for a long moment, torn between her pride and her desire. He could see her wavering, see the exact moment when desire won out. She set the dress down on the table and turned to him, her cheeks wet with tears. "Turn around," she said quietly. He turned to face the door, listening to the rustle of fabric as she changed. It seemed to take forever, and he imagined her fingers fumbling with the lacings, uncertain how to manage such fine clothing after months in rough wool. Finally, she spoke. "You can look now." He turned around, and the breath left his lungs in a rush. The dress fit her perfectly, as if it had been made specifically for her. The green fabric complemented her skin tone beautifully, making her look like some forest spirit stepped out of an old tale. The golden embroidery drew the eye along the lines of her body, emphasizing the curve of her waist and the graceful length of her neck. Her black hair fell loose around her shoulders, and with the firelight behind her, she looked absolutely radiant. But it was her face that struck him most. She was crying openly now, tears streaming down her cheeks as she looked down at herself in wonder. Her hands smoothed over the fabric again and again, as if she could not quite believe it was real. "I look like a person," she whispered, her voice breaking. "I look like a real person." "You have always been a real person," Emmett said, his own throat tight with emotion. "But yes, you look beautiful. The most beautiful woman I have ever seen." She looked up at him, her amber eyes swimming with tears, and suddenly she was crossing the small space between them and throwing her arms around his neck. He caught her automatically, holding her close as she sobbed into his shoulder. Her whole body shook with the force of her crying, and he realized she had been holding this back for a long time, holding back everything she had suffered, everything she had lost, everything she had been denied. "Thank you," she gasped between sobs. "Thank you, thank you, thank you." He held her and let her cry, rubbing slow circles on her back and murmuring wordless comfort. Outside, the wind picked up, rustling through the trees, but inside the cabin it was warm and safe. Eventually, her sobs quieted to sniffles, and she pulled back slightly to look at him. "I have never had anything this beautiful," she said, wiping at her eyes with the back of her hand. "My whole life, I have worn hand-me-downs and cast-offs and things I stitched together from scraps. I never thought I would own something like this." "You deserve beautiful things," Emmett said firmly. "You deserve everything good in this world." She laughed, a watery sound that was half sob. "You are too good to me, too good for me." "That is not true, and you know it." She reached up and touched his face, her palm warm against his cheek. "Why do you do this? Why do you care so much about me? I am just an orc woman hiding in the woods. I have nothing to offer you. I am nothing." "Stop that," he said, covering her hand with his. "You are not nothing. You are Greta Emberwood, and you are strong and brave and clever and kind. You survived things that would have broken other people. You kept yourself alive through an entire winter with nothing but your wits and determination. You are not nothing, and I will not let you say that about yourself." Fresh tears spilled down her cheeks, but these looked different. Softer somehow. "I am going to ruin this beautiful dress with all my crying. Then we will wash it," he said simply. She laughed again, more genuine this time, and stood on her toes to press a kiss to his cheek. It was the first time she had kissed him, even so chastely, and he felt heat rise in his face. "I love you," she said quietly, the words barely more than a breath. "I think I have loved you since you brought me that first loaf of bread and did not ask for anything in return." His heart felt too large for his chest. "I love you too. I have loved you for so long I cannot remember when it started." They stood there, holding each other in the warm glow of the firelight, and for a moment everything was perfect. But reality had a way of intruding on perfect moments, and Emmett felt it creeping in around the edges of his happiness. "The festival is in 3 days," he said quietly. "Are you still sure you want to come? I meant what I said about people seeing you, about not hiding anymore. But I will understand if you have changed your mind, if you are not ready." Greta pulled back and looked down at her dress, running her hands over the fabric once more. When she looked back up at him, there was determination in her amber eyes, mixed with fear but not overwhelmed by it. "I am terrified," she admitted. "But I am also tired of hiding. Tired of feeling like I do not exist, like I am not allowed to exist. I want to walk through the village with you. I want people to see me with you. I want them to know that I am not a monster, that I am just a woman who wants to live her life in peace." "Some of them will not be kind," Emmett warned. "Some of them will say terrible things." "I know," she said, but you will be with me, and that will make it bearable." He kissed her then, properly this time, pulling her close and pouring everything he felt into that kiss. She melted against him, her arms tightening around his neck, and for a long moment the world outside the cabin ceased to exist. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, Greta rested her forehead against his. "3 days," she said. "That gives me 3 days to prepare myself to face the world." "We will face it together," Emmett promised. "Whatever happens, we will face it together." The next 3 days passed in a strange blur of anticipation and anxiety. Emmett spent as much time as he could at the cabin, bringing what little food he could scrounge and trying to keep Greta's spirits up. She alternated between excitement and terror, trying on the dress repeatedly as if to reassure herself it was real, then taking it off and carefully folding it away. On the morning of the festival, Emmett woke early in his own small room at the boarding house where he rented a corner of a shared loft. He had spent the last of his copper pennies on a bath the night before and had scrubbed himself clean with harsh soap until his skin was pink. He dressed in his best clothes, which were not particularly impressive, but at least were clean and mended. His shirt was a simple white linen, his trousers dark brown wool, and he had borrowed a vest from another boarder that was only slightly too large. He looked at himself in the small, cracked mirror that hung on the wall and barely recognized the nervous man staring back at him. His brown hair was neatly combed, his jaw freshly shaved, and his blue eyes held an anxiety he could not quite hide. He was about to do something that would change his life forever, for better or worse. The walk to the cabin seemed to take no time at all. His feet carried him along the familiar path automatically, and before he knew it, he was knocking on the door with their familiar pattern. Greta opened the door, and his breath caught. She had done something different with her hair, braiding it back from her face in an intricate pattern that he did not recognize. The festival dress looked even more beautiful on her in the full light of day, the green fabric seeming to shimmer with every movement. She had even managed to clean her worn boots, though they looked painfully out of place with such a fine dress. "You look incredible," he managed to say. "I am terrified," she said, but she was smiling. "My hands have been shaking all morning." "Mine too," he admitted, holding out his hand. "Ready?" She looked at his hand for a long moment, then slowly reached out and took it. Her palm was warm and slightly damp with nervous sweat, and her fingers trembled as they laced with his. "Ready," she said, though her voice shook. They walked slowly through the forest, savoring these last moments of privacy before they emerged into the world. The morning was beautiful, with spring birdsong filling the air and new green shoots beginning to push up through the dead leaves on the forest floor. The world was waking up after its long winter sleep, and Emmett found a kind of poetry in the timing. They were waking up too, stepping out of hiding and into the light. As they reached the edge of the forest and the village came into view, Greta's steps faltered. "I cannot do this," she whispered, her hand tightening painfully on his. "Emmett, I cannot. Look at all those people. They will see me. They will know." The village square was already crowded with people preparing for the festival. Streamers hung from every building, and tables were being set up for the feast. Musicians were tuning their instruments in one corner, and children ran everywhere, shrieking with excitement. "You can do this," Emmett said firmly, turning to face her. "You are the bravest person I know, Greta. You survived things that would have destroyed most people. You can survive this." "But what if they hurt you?" she asked, her amber eyes wide with fear. "What if they attack you for being with me?" "I could not bear it if you were hurt because of me." "Then we will deal with it," he said simply. "Together." She took a long, shaky breath, then nodded. "Together." They stepped out of the forest and onto the road that led to the village square. For a few blessed moments, no one noticed them. Everyone was too busy with their own preparations, too focused on the festival to pay attention to two more people joining the crowd. But then a woman turned to call to her husband and spotted them. Her eyes went wide, and she elbowed the man next to her, pointing. He looked, and his expression hardened. Within seconds, it seemed like everyone in the square had noticed them, and a hush fell over the crowd that was more terrifying than any shout could have been. Emmett felt Greta try to pull back, but he held her hand firmly and kept walking forward. If they ran now, it would be over. They had to see this through. "Emmett Oakley," a voice called out, and he recognized Marcus Blackthorne, one of the village elders. "What is the meaning of this?" "I've come to the festival with Greta," Emmett said, his voice carrying across the suddenly silent square. "She is my guest." "That is an orc," Marcus said flatly, as if Emmett might not have noticed. "We do not allow orcs in Thornhaven." "There is no law against it," Emmett replied, keeping his voice steady. "I checked with the magistrate's records. Orcs are not prohibited from entering the village or attending public gatherings." He had indeed checked, spending an afternoon in the village hall going through dusty record books. It was true that orcs were rarely seen in human settlements and even more rarely welcome, but there was no actual law forbidding their presence. "There may be no law, but there is decency," Marcus said, his face reddening. "These creatures are dangerous. They are violent and savage. You are putting everyone here at risk." "She is not dangerous," Emmett said firmly. "Her name is Greta Emberwood, and she has lived in the forest near our village for 6 months without causing any harm to anyone. She is a person, just like you and me, and she has every right to be here." Murmurs rippled through the crowd, some angry, some uncertain. Emmett saw familiar faces in the mob, people he had worked with, people he had considered friends. Most looked uncomfortable, unsure how to react. A few looked openly hostile. "She is a monster," a voice shouted from the back of the crowd, and Emmett recognized Jacob Frost, a farmer who had always been quick with his fists and slow with his thinking. "They killed my uncle during the border wars, slaughtered him like an animal." "I am sorry for your loss," Greta said quietly, speaking for the first time. Her voice was steady despite the fear Emmett could feel radiating from her. "But I did not kill your uncle. I have never killed anyone. I have only tried to survive." "They are all the same," Jacob spat, pushing forward through the crowd. "Monsters, every one of them. She should not be here. She should not be allowed anywhere near decent people." "That is enough," a new voice said, and Emmett turned to see Thomas Brennan stepping forward. The old merchant looked at Greta thoughtfully, then at Emmett. "Is this the woman you bought the dress for?" "Yes," Emmett said. Thomas nodded slowly, as if confirming something he had already suspected. "She wears it well. It suits her." "You sold that dress to him knowing he was going to give it to an orc?" Marcus demanded, turning his anger on Thomas now. "You enabled this." "I sold a dress to a paying customer," Thomas said calmly. "What he chose to do with it was his business." "And I will tell you something else, Marcus Blackthorne. I have been watching young Emmett all winter, watching him scrape by on nothing while somehow managing to keep himself fed. I wondered where his money was going, wondered why a young man who used to save every penny was suddenly spending everything he earned. Now I know. He was taking care of someone who needed help. That is not something to be ashamed of. That is something to be admired." "She is an orc," Marcus repeated, as if this explained everything. "She is a person in a beautiful dress at a spring festival," Thomas countered. "And unless she causes some actual trouble, I see no reason to drive her away." "I will not stay where I am not welcome," Greta said quietly, and Emmett felt her trying to pull away again. "Emmett, please, let us go. This was a mistake." "No," he said firmly, loud enough for everyone to hear. "It was not a mistake. You have every right to be here. You are not a monster." You are not dangerous. You are just a woman who wanted to attend a festival in a pretty dress, and anyone who has a problem with that can take it up with me." Jacob Frost pushed fully to the front of the crowd now, his face twisted with anger. "Big words from a man who has been lying to us all winter. How long have you been hiding her in the woods, Oakley? How long have you been betraying your own kind?" "I have not betrayed anyone," Emmett said, his own anger rising now. "I helped someone who needed help. That is not betrayal. That is basic human decency." "She is not human," Jacob growled. "Neither is she a dog or a pig or any other animal you can treat however you like," Emmett shot back. "She is a thinking, feeling person with thoughts and dreams and feelings, and she deserves to be treated with respect." "You are a fool," Jacob said, and he spat at Emmett's feet. "A fool who is going to get people killed with your softness." "The only one threatening violence here is you," Emmett pointed out. Before Jacob could respond, another voice cut through the tension. "I think we should let them stay." Everyone turned to look at Sarah Meadows, a young mother with 2 small children clinging to her skirts. She looked nervous but determined. "My children are afraid," she continued, speaking directly to Greta now. "They have never seen an orc before, and they do not understand why you look different. But I want them to learn that different does not mean dangerous. I want them to grow up in a world where they judge people by their actions, not by their appearance." "Thank you," Greta said softly, her voice thick with emotion. "I am not saying I trust you," Sarah added quickly. "I am just saying that Emmett is right. If you have lived near our village for 6 months without causing trouble, then perhaps you are not the monster we were taught to fear. Perhaps you deserve a chance to prove yourself." More voices spoke up now, some in support, some still opposed. The crowd was splitting, no longer united in their hostility. Emmett saw his opportunity and took it. "All I am asking is for one day," he said, addressing the crowd at large. "Let Greta attend the festival. Let her prove that she is not a threat. If she causes any trouble, we will leave immediately and you will never see either of us again. But if she does not, if she is simply a guest like anyone else, then perhaps we can all learn something about judging too quickly." Marcus Blackthorne looked like he wanted to argue further, but he was a politician at heart, and he could read the mood of the crowd. It was no longer solidly against them. People were uncertain, divided. If he pushed too hard now, he would risk alienating the more moderate voices. "Fine," he said grudgingly. "She can stay, but one wrong move, one hint of trouble, and she is gone. Am I clear?" "Crystal clear," Emmett said, relief flooding through him. The crowd slowly dispersed, people going back to their festival preparations, but still casting uncertain glances in their direction. Emmett led Greta to a quieter corner of the square, where a low stone wall provided a place to sit. "I thought we were going to be killed," Greta said, sinking onto the wall. Her hands were shaking badly now, the adrenaline catching up with her. "So did I for a moment there," Emmett admitted, sitting beside her. "But we made it. You are here. You are at the festival." She looked around the square, taking it all in with wide eyes. The decorations, the people, the musicians setting up in the corner. Despite everything that had just happened, a smile slowly spread across her face. "I am," she said wonderingly. "I am really here." The festival began properly as the sun reached its zenith. Musicians struck up lively tunes, and people began to dance in the square. Tables groaned under the weight of food, everything from roasted meats to fresh bread to early spring vegetables. Children darted everywhere, their faces sticky with honey cakes and fruit preserves. Emmett and Greta stayed where they were for a while, simply watching. People gave them a wide berth, still uncertain how to react to the orc woman in their midst, but no one actively confronted them again. A few people even nodded in grudging acknowledgement as they passed. "Are you hungry?" Emmett asked, eyeing the food tables longingly. His stomach had been growling for the past hour, and he could not remember the last time he had seen such abundance. "Starving," Greta admitted. "But I do not think they will welcome us at their tables." "Only one way to find out," Emmett said, standing and offering his hand. They approached the food tables together, and Emmett felt every eye in the square tracking their movement. His skin prickled with awareness, but he kept his head high and his steps steady. When they reached the tables, the woman serving food, a plump grandmother named Agnes Potter, looked at them with a complicated expression. "How much?" Emmett asked, gesturing to the spread. "It is a community feast," Agnes said slowly. "Everyone who contributes to the village may eat freely." "I have worked for this village all winter," Emmett said firmly. "I helped repair roofs after the storms, I cleared snow from the roads, I worked in the granary sorting wheat. I have contributed." Agnes looked at Greta, then back at Emmett. Finally, she sighed and began loading 2 wooden plates with food. "I suppose you are right," she said. "Though I think you are making a mistake, Emmett Oakley, a terrible mistake." "Then it is my mistake to make," Emmett replied, taking the plates. They found a spot under a tree at the edge of the square and ate in silence, both too hungry and too emotionally exhausted for conversation. The food was incredible after months of thin soup and stale bread. Emmett watched Greta eat, seeing her eyes close in bliss with each bite, and felt his heart swell with affection. "Worth it," she said suddenly, looking at him with shining eyes. "Even if they chase us out tomorrow, this was worth it." As the afternoon wore on, the atmosphere slowly began to shift. Children, who had been kept carefully away from Greta at first, began to venture closer, their natural curiosity overcoming fear. A bold little girl approached, staring up at Greta with frank interest. "Why is your skin green?" the child asked with the brutal honesty only children possess. "Because I am an orc," Greta answered gently. "All orcs have green skin, just like all humans have skin like yours." "Are those teeth real?" the girl asked, pointing at Greta's small tusks. "They are," Greta said, smiling to show them properly. "Can I touch them?" the girl asked, already reaching up. "Careful now," her mother said, hurrying over to pull her back, but she did not look as hostile as she had earlier, just cautious. "I am sorry, children have no manners." "It is fine," Greta said. "She is just curious. That is natural." The girl's mother hesitated, then seemed to make a decision. "You really have been living in the forest all winter, in the old hunting cabin," Greta confirmed. "That must have been hard," the woman said, her tone softening slightly. "That cabin is barely more than a shack." "It kept out the worst of the cold," Greta said. "And Emmett brought me firewood and food. I would not have survived without his help." The woman looked at Emmett appraisingly. "You are a good man, Emmett Oakley. Foolish perhaps, but good." As the sun began to set, the dancing began in earnest. Couples whirled around the square to fiddle music, their feet stamping out intricate patterns. Emmett watched with longing, remembering festivals from past years when he had danced with village girls and laughed without care. "You want to dance?" Greta asked quietly, reading his expression. "Not without you," he said immediately. "Then ask me," she said, standing and holding out her hand. He took her hand and led her to the edge of the dancing area, not quite brave enough to push into the center. The music was a simple country reel, and he fell into the familiar steps easily, guiding Greta through the movements. She followed his lead naturally, her feet finding the rhythm with an ease that surprised him. "You know how to dance," he said, spinning her under his arm. "Orcs have festivals too," she said, laughing. "We are not complete savages." They danced 3 songs together, and by the third one, Emmett noticed that people were no longer actively avoiding them. The other dancers simply moved around them, incorporating them into the natural flow of movement. It was not acceptance, Not yet, but it was tolerance. It was a start. As full dark fell and lanterns were lit around the square, Emmett and Greta found themselves sitting by one of the bonfires that had been lit for warmth and light. Greta was leaning against his shoulder, tired but happy, her green skin glowing in the firelight. "Thank you," she said softly, "for the dress, for bringing me here, for everything." "You do not need to thank me," Emmett replied. "I did it because I love you, I know," she said. "But I am going to thank you anyway." They sat in comfortable silence for a while, watching the fire crackle and listening to the distant music. Then Thomas Brennan appeared out of the darkness, settling onto the log beside them with a grunt of old joints. "Mind if I sit?" he asked, though he was already sitting. "Not at all," Emmett said. Thomas was quiet for a moment, staring into the fire. Then he said, "My son married an orc woman, 30 years ago, down in the border territories where such things were more common." Emmett and Greta both turned to stare at him in surprise. "I never knew that," Emmett said. "Not many people do," Thomas replied. "It was during the last years of the war and things were complicated, but he loved her and she loved him and they made it work. They had 3 children together, fine, strong youngsters who were the best of both peoples. My grandchildren." "What happened to them?" Greta asked softly. "They are still down in the border territories, running a successful trading post," Thomas said. "My son writes to me sometimes, tells me how well they are doing. I have not seen them in years because the journey is too long for these old bones now, but I am proud of them, proud of the life they have built together." "Why are you telling us this?" Emmett asked. "Because I want you to know that it can work," Thomas said, looking at them seriously. "It will not be easy. People will judge you, some will hate you. But if you love each other, if you are willing to fight for each other, you can build something good, something worth having." "Thank you," Greta said, her voice thick with emotion. "That means more than you know." Thomas nodded and stood, his knees creaking. "The dress looks beautiful on you, by the way. Better than I imagined when I ordered it from the seamstress. I am glad it went to someone who appreciates it." He walked away, disappearing back into the crowd, and Emmett and Greta were left staring at each other in wonder. "There are others," Greta whispered. "There are other couples like us." "There are," Emmett agreed. "We are not alone." The festival wound down slowly as the night grew late. Families with young children departed first, then the elderly, then the young couples looking for privacy. Emmett and Greta stayed by the fire until it burned down to embers, reluctant to let the night end. Finally, when they were among the last people remaining in the square, they stood and began the walk back to the forest. Greta's steps were slow, tired but content, and she held Emmett's hand tightly. "I did not want to say this earlier," she said as they walked through the dark streets. "But I do not think I can go back to hiding in that cabin, not after tonight, not after tasting what it is like to be part of the world again." "You should not have to hide," Emmett agreed. "No one should have to live like that." "But where can I go?" she asked, her voice breaking slightly. "I have no money, no prospects. Even if some people in Thornhaven are willing to tolerate me, that does not mean I can build a life here." Emmett had been thinking about this problem for weeks now, turning it over and over in his mind during his long walks to and from the cabin. He had no good answer. He had no money himself, barely enough to pay for his corner of the boarding house loft. He had no land, no trade beyond general labor. What could he offer her? But as they walked through the quiet night, an idea began to form. It was audacious, probably impossible, but once it took hold, he could not let it go. "Marry me," he said abruptly. Greta stopped walking, turning to stare at him. "What? Marry me?" he repeated, the words coming faster now as the plan solidified in his mind. "If you are my wife, legally bound to me, no one can drive you away. You would have the same rights as any human woman. You could live in the village openly. We could find a way to make it work together. Emmett, that is insane, she said, but he could hear the hope creeping into her voice. No one would marry us. No priest would perform the ceremony. The magistrate can perform civil marriages, Emmett said. I checked that too when I was looking up the laws about orcs in the village. We do not need a priest. We just need the magistrate's signature on a document. And you think the magistrate would agree to marry a human man to an orc woman? Greta asked skeptically. I think if we ask him publicly with witnesses, he will find it hard to refuse, Emmett said. Especially after tonight. We proved that you are not a threat. We proved that people can tolerate us being together. If we push now, while people are still uncertain and divided, we might be able to get through before they can organize opposition. Greta was shaking her head, but she was also crying again, tears streaming down her green cheeks in the moonlight. This is crazy. You are crazy. You are talking about binding yourself to me forever, throwing away any chance of a normal life. I do not want a normal life without you, Emmett said fiercely. I want you, Greta. I want to wake up next to you every morning. I want to work beside you every day. I want to build a life with you, whatever that life looks like. So yes, I am asking you to marry me. Will you? She stared at him for a long moment, her amber eyes searching his face. He could see her weighing it, considering every angle, looking for the trap or the hidden cost. But there was no trap. He loved her and he wanted to marry her. It was as simple and as complicated as that. Yes, she finally whispered. Yes, I will marry you. He swept her into his arms and kissed her, not caring that they were standing in the middle of the road where anyone might see. She kissed him back with equal fervor, her arms tight around his neck, and for a long, perfect moment nothing else existed. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, Emmett said, "We should go to the magistrate first thing in the morning. Strike while people are still feeling generous from the festival." "In the morning," Greta agreed. "Tonight can we just be happy? Just for a few hours before we have to fight again. We can be happy," Emmett said, taking her hand and resuming their walk toward the forest. "We can be as happy as we want." They reached the cabin and went inside, closing the door on the world outside. Emmett built up the fire while Greta carefully removed the festival dress, folding it with reverent care and setting it aside. They lay down together on the straw mattress, wrapped in blankets and each other's arms, and talked long into the night about their hopes and dreams, and the future they would build together. Morning came too soon, pale light creeping through the cracks in the walls. Emmett woke with Greta nestled against his chest, her black hair spread across his shoulder. He lay still for a moment, savoring the warmth and closeness before gently shaking her awake. "It is morning," he said softly. "We should go before I lose my nerve." She nodded, rubbing sleep from her eyes, and they both dressed quickly. Greta reached for the festival dress, but Emmett stopped her. "Save it for the wedding," he said. "Today, maybe it is better to look less conspicuous." She nodded understanding and put on her old brown wool dress instead. It looked even more shabby and worn after wearing the festival dress, and Emmett made a mental note that they would need to get her more clothes somehow. But that was a problem for later. Right now, they needed to get married before anyone could stop them. The walk to the village was quick, both of them moving with nervous energy. The square was quiet this early, with only a few people moving about cleaning up from the previous night's celebration. Emmett led Greta directly to the magistrate's office, a small building near the village hall. Magistrate Cornelius Webb was an older man, pragmatic and known for following the law to the letter. If anyone would marry them based purely on legal grounds, it would be him. Emmett knocked firmly on the door. "Enter," a voice called from inside. They stepped into a small office cluttered with ledgers and official documents. Magistrate Webb looked up from his desk, his expression neutral until he saw Greta. Then his eyebrows rose. "Emmett Oakley," he said slowly. "And the orc woman from last night. What can I do for you?" "We want to get married," Emmett said, forcing himself to sound more confident than he felt. "Right now, this morning, we want you to perform a civil marriage ceremony." Webb leaned back in his chair, steepling his fingers. "You want me to marry you to an orc woman?" "I want you to marry two consenting adults who are legally permitted to wed," Emmett corrected. "Is there any law preventing it?" Webb was silent for a long moment, clearly thinking through the legal ramifications. Finally, he said, "No. There is no specific law preventing the marriage of humans and orcs. The marriage statutes simply require that both parties be of age, be of sound mind, and consent freely. Nothing about species." "Then you will do it?" Greta asked, hope bright in her voice. "I did not say that," Webb replied. "Just because something is legal does not mean it is wise. Do you understand what you are doing, Emmett? The implications this will have for your life?" "I understand perfectly," Emmett said firmly. "I love Greta. I want to marry her. Everything else we will figure out as we go." "And you?" Webb asked, looking at Greta. "Do you understand what you are agreeing to? The difficulties you will face?" "I do," Greta said quietly. "But I would rather face those difficulties as Emmett's wife than continue hiding alone in the forest." Webb sighed and pulled a ledger toward him, flipping through pages until he found what he was looking for. "Very well. I will perform the ceremony, but I want witnesses. If I am going to do something this unprecedented, I want it properly documented so no one can claim later that it was done improperly." "Who should we get as witnesses?" Emmett asked, his heart pounding. They were actually going to do this. It was really happening. "I will send for Thomas Brennan and Sarah Meadows," Webb said. "They both spoke in your favor last night. If they are willing to witness, it will lend legitimacy to the proceedings." He stepped out of the office, leaving Emmett and Greta alone for a moment. They looked at each other, both scared and excited and barely able to believe this was real. "Are we really doing this?" Greta whispered. "We really are," Emmett replied, taking both her hands in his. "No going back now." "I do not want to go back," she said firmly. "I want to go forward." "With you?" Webb returned a few minutes later with Thomas and Sarah in tow. Both looked surprised but not entirely unhappy about being summoned. "You are getting married?" Thomas asked, a smile playing at the corners of his mouth. "Well, that is quick work." "When you know," Emmett said, feeling heat rise in his cheeks. "I wish you both happiness," Sarah said to Greta, her tone sincere. "I meant what I said yesterday. I want my children to grow up in a world where they judge people by their actions. You have done nothing but try to survive and now try to build a life. That deserves respect." The ceremony itself was brief and businesslike. Webb read from the legal text, asked them each if they consented to the marriage, and had them sign the marriage register with Thomas and Sarah witnessing. The whole thing took perhaps 10 minutes, but when it was done, Emmett and Greta were legally married. "Congratulations," Webb said, his tone dry but not unkind. "May you have better luck than I expect you will need." They stumbled out of the magistrate's office in a daze, legally wed but barely able to process what had just happened. Thomas clapped Emmett on the shoulder. "Well done, lad. Now comes the hard part." "What is the hard part?" Emmett asked. "Actually building a life together," Thomas said. "Love is all well and good, but you need money, housing, work. Have you thought about any of that?" Emmett had to admit he had not thought much beyond getting married. "Not really." Thomas shook his head, but he was smiling. "Come to my shop this afternoon. I may have some work for you both if you are willing." "Really?" Greta asked, her voice full of hope. "Really," Thomas confirmed. "I am getting old and I could use help with inventory and repairs. and someone who can sew as neatly as that dress was embroidered would be useful in a general store. We can discuss terms this afternoon." He walked away, leaving them standing in the empty street. Sarah had already departed, hurrying back to her children. Emmett and Greta were alone, married but uncertain what came next. "We need to find somewhere to live," Greta said practically. "The cabin is not suitable for winter, and if I am going to be living openly in the village, I cannot keep hiding in the forest." "The boarding house might have room," Emmett suggested, though he doubted they would welcome an orc resident. "Or," Greta said slowly, an idea forming in her voice, "we could see if there are any abandoned homesteads nearby. Places people left during the war that no one has reclaimed. If we could fix one up, make it livable, we could have our own home." "That is a good idea," Emmett said, warming to the thought. "I know some carpentry. Between us, we could probably manage repairs." They spent the rest of the morning walking the outskirts of the village, asking locals about abandoned properties. Finally, old Agnes Potter mentioned a small farmstead about a mile east of the village that had been empty for 5 years, ever since the original owners died without heirs. "It is probably falling to pieces by now," she warned. "But if you can fix it up, I suppose no one would stop you from claiming it. The village council has been meaning to auction it off, but no one wants land that far from the main road." They found the farmstead that afternoon, and Agnes had been right. It was in terrible shape. The small house had a collapsed roof in one corner, broken windows, and a door hanging off its hinges. The barn was worse, and the fields were completely overgrown. But the bones were good, solid stone foundation and thick walls. With work, it could be made livable. "It is perfect," Greta said, her eyes shining as she looked around. "It is a disaster," Emmett corrected, but he was smiling. "But yes, it is perfect. Our disaster." They spent the afternoon clearing debris from the main room of the house, and by evening they had a space that was at least sheltered from the elements. Emmett borrowed a ladder from a neighbor and patched the worst of the roof holes with scrap wood. It was not pretty, but it would keep out rain. That night, they built a small fire in the old fireplace and lay together on a pile of straw they had gathered from the barn, watching firelight dance on the walls of their new home. "We are married," Greta said wonderingly. "I am your wife." "You are my wife," Emmett agreed, pulling her closer. "Greta Oakley," she laughed at that. "I have a human name now. That is strange to think about." "You can keep Emberwood if you prefer," Emmett said quickly. "I do not want you to lose yourself." "No," she said firmly. "I want to be Greta Oakley. I want to be your wife in every way. The past is past. This is my new life." They made love for the first time that night, gentle and careful with each other, learning the map of each other's bodies in the flickering firelight. Afterward, they lay tangled together, exhausted and happy. The following days fell into a pattern. Each morning they worked on the house, making repairs and improvements. Emmett proved handy with basic carpentry, and Greta had an unexpected talent for masonry, knowing how to mix mortar and patch stone walls. Slowly, the house began to look less like a ruin and more like a home. In the afternoons, they went to Thomas's store and worked for wages. Emmett helped with heavy lifting and basic repairs, while Greta proved invaluable with her sewing skills. She could repair torn clothes, hem trousers, and even create simple garments from scratch. Word spread quickly, and soon people were bringing their mending directly to the store, specifically requesting the orc woman's services. Not everyone was accepting. Some people still muttered when they passed, still gave hostile looks. Jacob Frost, in particular, remained openly hostile, though he was careful not to do anything overtly threatening after Marcus Blackthorne had a quiet word with him about keeping the peace. But slowly, grudgingly, the village began to adapt to having an orc woman in their midst. Children grew used to seeing her and stopped staring. Older residents became accustomed to her presence in the store. A few people even began to greet her by name when they passed on the street. 2 months after their marriage, their house was finally habitable. The roof was fully repaired, the windows had glass again, and they had scrounged enough furniture to make the place comfortable. Greta had sewn curtains from fabric scraps Thomas had given her, and she had planted a vegetable garden in the cleared field behind the house. It was small and humble, but it was theirs. One evening, as they sat outside watching the sunset, Greta said quietly, "I am happy." "So am I," Emmett replied, taking her hand. "I never thought I could be this happy," she continued. "After everything that happened before, everything I ran from. I thought I would spend the rest of my life alone and afraid, but you changed that. You gave me a home." "You gave me one too," Emmett said. "I was just drifting before I met you, working odd jobs and barely surviving. You gave me purpose. You gave me something to work for." They sat in comfortable silence, watching the sky fade from orange to purple to deep blue. Stars began to appear, familiar constellations tracking across the heavens. "You want children?" Greta asked suddenly. Emmett turned to look at her in surprise. "I had not thought about it. Do you?" "I do," she admitted. "I know it would be complicated. Human orc children are rare, and people will judge them even more harshly than they judge us. But I want a family. I want children to raise in this house we have built together." "Then we will have children," Emmett said firmly. "As many as you want, and we will raise them to be strong and brave and kind, just like their mother." She smiled at that, leaning her head on his shoulder. "Just like their father, too." Summer arrived, bringing long days of hard work in their garden and continued employment at Thomas's store. Greta's sewing business had grown to the point where she was making more than Emmett was with general labor. People who had been suspicious of her at first now sought out her services specifically, praising her neat stitches and fair prices. In late summer, Greta confirmed what they had both been hoping for. She was pregnant. The news spread through the village quickly, and reactions were mixed. Some people were genuinely happy for them. Others were horrified at the thought of a half-orc child being born in their village. The village council even held a special meeting to discuss whether there should be restrictions on where the child could go or what it could do. Thomas Brennan shut down that discussion with a forceful reminder that the child would be born a citizen of Thornhaven, with all the rights that entailed, and any attempt to restrict those rights would be not only immoral but illegal. Greta's pregnancy was difficult. She suffered terrible sickness in the early months, and as she grew larger, her body struggled to carry the child. The village midwife, a formidable woman named Alina Crane, examined her and shook her head. "I have never delivered a half-orc baby," she admitted. "I do not know what to expect. But I will do my best." The pregnancy lasted 9 months, and in early spring, as flowers began to bloom in their garden, Greta went into labor. It was a long, difficult birth that lasted through the day and into the night. Emmett stayed by her side the entire time, holding her hand and whispering encouragement even as he fought down his own terror. Finally, just before dawn, their son was born. He was small and perfect, with green-tinged skin that was lighter than his mother's but darker than his father's. He had tiny nubs where tusks would eventually grow, and when he opened his eyes, they were a beautiful hazel that seemed to be a blend of both his parents. He had a healthy set of lungs, which he demonstrated immediately with a powerful wail. "He is beautiful," Greta sobbed, holding him to her chest. "Emmett, he is perfect." "He is," Emmett agreed, tears streaming down his own face. "What should we name him?" They had discussed names during the pregnancy, but nothing had felt right. Now, looking at their son's face, Greta said quietly, Xavier Oakley." "Xavier," Emmett repeated, testing the name. Yes, that is perfect. Alina, the midwife, cleaned up efficiently, giving them instructions for caring for the newborn. She was professional but not unkind, and as she was leaving, she paused at the door. He is a healthy baby, she said. Strong lungs, good color, you should be proud. We are, Greta said firmly. The first few months with Xavier were exhausting. He was a fussy baby who did not sleep well and seemed to cry at the slightest provocation. But he was theirs, and they loved him with a fierce protectiveness that surprised them both. The village's reaction to Xavier was complicated. Some people cooed over him the way they would any baby, charmed by his tiny hands and big eyes. Others refused to even look at him, turning away when Greta carried him through the streets. A few made openly hostile comments about half-breeds and abominations, though never when Emmett was close enough to hear clearly. But Thomas Brennan commissioned a cradle to be built and delivered it to their house with no charge. Sarah Meadows brought by baby clothes her own children had outgrown. Alina, the midwife, checked on Xavier regularly, making sure he was growing properly. And slowly, grudgingly, the village began to accept that Xavier was simply part of their community now, as much as any other child born that spring. As Xavier grew from infant to toddler, he proved to be a bright, curious child. His mixed heritage gave him the best of both his parents. He had his mother's strength and his father's quick mind. He learned to walk early, stumbling around their house on unsteady legs while Greta watched with a mixture of pride and terror. When Xavier was 2 years old, Greta became pregnant again. This pregnancy was easier than the first, and 9 months later she gave birth to a daughter. They named her Rosalie, and she had more human features than her brother, with only a slight green tint to her skin and barely noticeable tusks. Her hair was black like her mother's, and her eyes were a bright blue like Emmett's. With 2 children, their small house felt suddenly very crowded. Emmett spent that autumn expanding, adding 2 more rooms to give the children space to grow. Thomas hired a young man to help with the heavy work at the store, giving Emmett more time to focus on carpentry. He discovered he had a real talent for it, and soon he was getting hired by other villagers to build furniture and repair houses. Greta continued her sewing work, now from home so she could watch the children. Her reputation had grown to the point where people from neighboring villages would travel to Thornhaven specifically to commission clothes from her. She began to teach herself more advanced techniques, creating intricate embroidery and delicate lacework that commanded premium prices. Between them, they were making enough money to live comfortably. They were not wealthy, but they had enough to feed their family, maintain their house, and even save a little for the future. It was more than Emmett had ever dared to dream when he had spent his last silver on that festival dress 3 years ago. The Spring Awakening Festival came around again, and this time when Emmett and Greta walked into the village square, they did so without fear. Greta wore the same festival dress, still beautiful though it was now 3 years old and had been carefully mended in a few places. Xavier rode on Emmett's shoulders, and Rosalie was strapped to Greta's chest in a cloth sling. People greeted them by name, asked how the children were doing, commented on how big Xavier had grown. Jacob Frost still glared from across the square, but he kept his distance. Most of the hostility had faded, replaced by casual acceptance or at least indifference. They danced again that night, carefully because of the baby, but with the same joy they had felt at that first festival. Xavier tried to copy their steps, his toddler legs pumping as he attempted to keep the rhythm. Other children played with him without apparent concern about his green skin, treating him simply as another child. "We made it," Greta said quietly as they swayed together. "We actually made it." "We did," Emmett agreed. "Together." Years passed. Xavier started school, where he proved to be a gifted student despite some initial bullying from older children. Rosalie grew into a sweet, gentle girl who loved animals and spent hours in their expanded garden. Greta gave birth to 2 more children, another daughter named Lily and a son named Vincent, each unique blends of their parents' heritage. Their house grew to accommodate the expanding family, and Emmett's carpentry business thrived. Greta's sewing work became so renowned that she began training apprentices, teaching young women in the village the intricate techniques she had mastered. Thomas Brennan passed away when Xavier was 10, leaving his store to his own family, but also leaving a substantial gift to Emmett and Greta in his will, along with a letter thanking them for showing the village that different peoples could live together in peace. More orc families began to settle in the area, drawn by stories of Thornhaven's relative tolerance. It was never easy, and there were always people who held onto prejudice, but slowly the composition of the village changed. Mixed marriages became less shocking. Half-orc children became a common sight in the school. On their 10th wedding anniversary, Emmett took Greta back to the old hunting cabin where she had spent that terrible winter. It was still standing, though even more dilapidated now. They sat on the step where he had first stacked firewood for her and looked around the clearing that had been the beginning of everything. "Do you remember being so scared?" Greta asked, leaning against him. "Terrified," Emmett admitted. "I was sure someone was going to hurt one of us. I had no plan, no money, no idea how to make it work." "But you did it anyway," Greta said. "You spent your last silver on a dress for an orc woman you barely knew just because you wanted her to feel beautiful." "Best silver I ever spent," Emmett said firmly. She laughed and kissed him, and for a moment they were young again, standing in the village square in the firelight, daring to hope for a future that seemed impossible. But they had made it possible. Through courage and love and sheer stubbornness, they had built a life together that was rich in all the ways that mattered. They had a home, a family, a community that had learned to accept them. It was more than either of them had dared to dream. As the sun set over the forest, casting long shadows through the trees, they stood and began the walk back to their house. Their children would be home from their various activities soon, filling the house with noise and laughter and chaos. There would be dinner to prepare, homework to supervise, bedtime stories to read. It was an ordinary life, really. The kind of life that countless families lived every day. But for Emmett and Greta, who had fought so hard for the right to simply exist together, that ordinary life was extraordinary. It was everything they had fought for, everything they had risked, everything they had hoped. And as they walked hand in hand through the familiar forest path, they knew with absolute certainty that they would do it all again. Every struggle, every challenge, every moment of fear and uncertainty. Because at the end of that path was each other, and a love that had proven stronger than prejudice, stronger than fear, stronger than anything the world could throw at them. Their story did not end with grand gestures or dramatic victories. It ended with the quiet contentment of a life well lived, with children who would grow up knowing they were loved, with a community that had been changed for the better by their presence. It ended with 2 people who had taken a chance on each other when the world said they should not, and had built something beautiful in defiance of all expectations. And every spring, when the festival came around again, Greta would take out that green dress with the golden embroidery. She would hold it up and remember the day Emmett had given it to her, the day she had cried because someone had finally made her feel like a person who deserved beautiful things. The dress had been altered over the years to accommodate her changing body, had been mended and refreshed countless times, but it was still the same dress. still the symbol of everything they had overcome. She would wear it to the festival, and Emmett would dance with her under the lanterns, and their children would play with the other village children, and everything would be exactly as it should be. Perfect in its imperfection, beautiful in its ordinariness, precious beyond measure because they had fought for it together. Years continued to flow like water, each season bringing new challenges and joys. Xavier grew into a strong young man who inherited his father's skill with carpentry and his mother's business sense, eventually taking over much of Emmett's work as age began to slow his father down. He married a human woman from the next village over, a teacher named Margaret who loved him for his gentle nature and sharp mind, and they gave Emmett and Greta their first grandchildren. Rosalie became a healer, apprenticing with Alina the midwife and eventually taking over her practice. Her mixed heritage seemed to give her a unique understanding of different people's needs, and she became known throughout the region for her skill and compassion. She remained unmarried, claiming she was too busy for romance, though Greta suspected there was a young merchant from the border territories who might change her mind eventually. Lily surprised everyone by showing a gift for music, and she traveled to the southern cities to study at a proper conservatory. She wrote home regularly, filling her letters with descriptions of concerts and festivals and the wider world beyond their small village. Vincent became a farmer, taking over some of the land around their house and expanding it into a proper working farm that provided food for much of the village. Emmett and Greta grew old together, their hair turning gray, their bodies slowing with age. But they never stopped working, never stopped contributing to their community. Greta sewed until her fingers became too stiff with arthritis, and even then she supervised her apprentices with a keen eye. Emmett built furniture until his back could no longer handle the heavy lifting, and then he taught younger men the skills he had spent a lifetime perfecting. On their 20th wedding anniversary, the village threw them a celebration in the square, acknowledging what everyone had come to accept, that Emmett and Greta Oakley were foundational members of the community. The next generation had grown up with their story, and to the children born in the last decade, the idea of a human man married to an orc woman was simply normal. It was just how things were. Marcus Blackthorne, who had been so hostile at that first festival, gave a speech acknowledging that he had been wrong to oppose their union. He was an old man now, his fire mostly burned out, and he admitted that the village was better for having welcomed Greta and her family. Jacob Frost never did come around, but his children did. His daughter even brought her mending to Greta's workshop and chatted pleasantly while waiting for repairs. Some prejudices died hard, but they did die, given enough time and enough proof that they were wrong. On their 25th anniversary, Emmett had a special gift commissioned. It was a new version of that first festival dress, made by Greta's best apprentice under her careful supervision. The original was too worn now to be worn safely, too precious to risk damaging further, but this new dress was an exact copy. Same green fabric, same golden embroidery, every detail reproduced perfectly. When Greta opened the package and saw it, she cried just as she had cried 25 years earlier. Not from sadness or despair this time, but from pure joy, from gratitude for a life that had given her so much more than she had ever thought possible. "You keep making me cry over dresses," she told Emmett through her tears, laughing. "That is because you look beautiful in them," he replied, pulling her close. They went to the festival that year, wearing their best clothes and walking slowly because their bodies were not as strong as they once were. But they still danced, carefully and slowly, holding each other close and remembering the frightened young people they had been when this all began. Their grandchildren played in the square, a mix of human and orc and every combination between, all accepted without question by the other children. The world had changed, and they had been part of that change. They had helped make a future where their grandchildren would never have to hide, never have to be afraid of loving who they loved. As the night grew late and they prepared to walk home, Sarah Meadows approached them. She was an old woman herself now, her children grown with families of their own, but she still had that same determined look in her eyes. "I wanted to thank you," she said to Greta. "My grandson is courting an orc woman from one of the settlements up north. They are talking about marriage. And I realized that none of this would be possible if you and Emmett had not been brave enough to go first. You made it easier for everyone who came after." "We just wanted to be together," Greta said simply. "We did not set out to change anything." "But you did anyway," Sarah replied. "You changed everything, just by refusing to hide. Thank you for that." The years continued their steady march. Emmett's health began to fail as he entered his 60s, his body worn down by decades of hard physical labor. Greta cared for him with the same devotion he had shown her in that first terrible winter, bringing him meals, helping him dress, sitting with him through long nights when pain kept sleep away. On a spring morning 30 years after they had married, Emmett woke to find Greta sitting beside their bed, watching the sunrise through the window of the house they had rebuilt together. She was 72 years old now, her green skin weathered and creased with age, her black hair completely gray. But to him, she was still the most beautiful woman he had ever seen. "Good morning," she said, noticing he was awake. "How are you feeling?" "Like an old man," he admitted, which made her laugh. "You are an old man," she pointed out. "We both are old now." "When did that happen?" he asked, only half joking. "Slowly," she said, taking his hand. "So slowly we barely noticed until one day we looked in the mirror and saw our parents staring back at us." He squeezed her hand gently, feeling the familiar shape of her fingers, the rough patches where years of sewing had calloused her skin. "I have loved every day with you," he said quietly. "Even the hard ones. Especially the hard ones, maybe." "Me too," she said, her voice thick with emotion. "You gave me a life, Emmett. A real life with a family and a home and a place in the world. I would have died in that cabin if you had not found me. I would have frozen to death, alone and forgotten. But I did find you," he said, "and you let me help you even though you were scared. That took courage." "We were both brave," she said. "Young and stupid and brave, the best combination." They sat together in comfortable silence, watching the light grow stronger as the sun climbed higher. Somewhere in the house, they could hear the sounds of their youngest daughter moving around, probably making breakfast. Lily had come home from the cities to help care for her aging parents, postponing her career to make sure they were comfortable in their final years. "You have any regrets?" Greta asked suddenly, then immediately shook her head. "No, forget I asked that. That is a stupid question." But Emmett answered anyway, because he always answered her honestly. "No regrets. Not a single one. I would spend every last coin I had 1,000 times over if it meant ending up here with you." She leaned down and kissed him, her lips soft and familiar. "That dress changed my life." "You changed mine," he replied. They spent that day together, talking and reminiscing and simply being present with each other. Xavier and Vincent visited with their families. Rosalie stopped by after her rounds to check on her father's health. The house was full of life and laughter and love, everything they had built together over 3 decades. As evening fell and their children departed to their own homes, Emmett and Greta sat on the porch of their house, watching the stars emerge in the darkening sky. The same stars they had watched on their first night together in this house, when it was still barely habitable and they had nothing but each other and their hopes. "We did good," Greta said quietly. "Did we not? We built something good here." "We built something beautiful," Emmett agreed. "Against all odds, despite everything, we made it work." She leaned against him, and he wrapped his arm around her shoulders, holding her close as they had held each other through countless nights. And as the stars wheeled overhead and the night grew deeper, they knew with absolute certainty that their love had been worth every struggle, every sacrifice, every moment of fear and doubt. Because love, real love, was not about grand gestures or perfect moments. It was about choosing each other every single day, even when it was hard, especially when it was hard. It was about spending your last silver on a dress for someone who needed to feel beautiful. It was about building a life together one day at a time, one challenge at a time, until suddenly you looked back and realized you had created something extraordinary out of the ordinary materials of everyday life. Their story was ending now, as all stories must. But what they had built would continue long after they were gone. In their children and grandchildren, in the community they had helped shape, in the countless small ways they had made the world better by simply refusing to accept that their love was wrong. And somewhere, preserved carefully in a chest in their bedroom, was that first green dress with golden embroidery. The dress that had cost every coin Emmett had to his name. The dress that had made Greta cry when she tried it on, because it made her feel like a real person for the first time in her life. The dress that had been the beginning of everything that came after. It was just a dress, really. Fabric and thread and careful stitching. But it had become a symbol of something much larger. A symbol of hope, of courage, of the transformative power of love. A reminder that sometimes the smallest gestures, made with genuine care and affection, could change entire lives. And as Emmett and Greta Oakley sat together under the stars, surrounded by the life they had built through 3 decades of love and labor, they knew that every moment had been worth it. Every coin, every tear, every struggle. Because they had each other, and they had created a family and a home and a legacy that would endure long after they were both gone. That was enough. More than enough. It was everything.